Um, there you go. So there's the agenda. So here we are, we've started off, but first up will be Jamie, who'll be talking about the hierarchy of care. Then that'll be followed by Boris and Candida, that'll be looking at conservation planning and management in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So we've got a good session there. And then that's followed by Angelica, who'll be looking at a case study on Antrim House, which is, of course, where we're based for Heritage New Zealand Pouhere Taonga. Then we'll have an opportunity for questions. So I really encourage why the presenters are presenting, that you are thinking about those questions and thinking about how you might be implementing these within your organisation. So it's a good opportunity to ask them for advice on that, because they're your experts today. I'll have some final thoughts closing off, and just looking forward to the next and final webinar session. So that's probably everything we need to know. So let's make a start. So I'll hand over to Jamie. Kia ora, Jamie.
Kia ora koutou. Very nice to be here. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about the philosophy that sits behind conservation planning. Conservation plans are all about a hierarchy of care and sort of working out what are the most important things, what are the least important things, or the less important things, I should say, and understanding a place. But it's sort of like, this is getting to the basics of how do you conceive of parts, and how do you conceive of a condition versus integrity? And a lot of this feeds into the work we do, the regional work in particular, with properties that that we own and manage within Heritage New Zealand. Angela, could I have the next slide? So just, these are all, these aren't all of the central properties, but these are a range of central properties. Just a reminder that, so we're not just the advice givers, we are owners, we are planners, we have to basically walk the walk. A lot of the advice that we give the public and owners on how to care for their places, we do for our own places. And I won't go through all these places, some of them will be familiar, that include cultural landscapes, buildings, structures, and a whole range of things that I'll be talking about shortly. So, but we have 45 properties in total, and there's 12 in the central region. Just a thing to keep in mind about our properties, they're a varied portfolio, which you can see here, and they're even more varied when you go out elsewhere into the country. And we have both staffed and unstaffed properties. They're an opportunity for direct public education. And regardless of whether they're staffed or unstaffed, we'd like to have a consistent visitor experience so that somebody leaves these places with an understanding of why they're important to history and why they're an important place to visit. But we're going to talk a little bit more about strategic planning of capital projects and also routine maintenance. All of these places, we have to do a lot of thinking on everything from a plumbing leak up to a seismic strengthening project. And Angelica will be talking later about Antrim House specifically, but I'll just be going through some basic concepts right now. Angelica, could you have? One thing that's really confused, particularly in the media, is the difference between condition and integrity. And I put Gordon Wilson Flats up there because a lot of people look at it in Wellington and it's actually more tagged than it is in this photo. Now, a lot of people see it as, because its condition is bad, it's irredeemable, it's past being returned to a state where we might value it and enjoy it again. So condition is an assessment of the physical state of a property or place, and conclusions about the physical state are generally structured by high-level, reasonably objective scale with ratings of poor, fair, good, or excellent, or similar. And they could take into account the built fabric and relevant landscape or setting, and applies to any place, heritage or not. So you have condition assessments for basically anything that's built to understand just generally what the condition is, the structural condition, the sheathing condition, the systems conditions. So I'll say very clearly that while the condition of Gordon Wilson Flats may cause a lot of people to conclude it's irredeemable, the integrity is actually quite intact. So the integrity is the assessment of the wholeness or intactness of a place, including its meaning and sense of place, and all the tangible and intangible attributes and elements necessary to express or convey its cultural heritage, values, and areas of significance. So integrity is the condition is looking at the physical place and what its sort of state as. Integrity is looking at its values and how it relates to that physical place. So in these two definitions, sorry, the condition one came from the Historic Hawaii Foundation. The integrity is from ICAMO's New Zealand Charter, just to give you an idea. That very similar definitions used throughout the world, but I think it's important to indicate the difference between these things because they're often conflated. Could I have the next slide, Angelica? So this is an assessment framework that's used by the National Park Service, which is the cultural heritage arm of the US government for all federal projects. And I find it's really useful because every listing project has to take into account integrity and has to evaluate integrity based on these 7 aspects of integrity. And you do have to have an actual statement about it. So I think it's a really good thing to get people thinking. This is very similar to how we think about things in New Zealand and elsewhere in the world, but to have it so concretely spelled out is really an easy way to sort of be contemplating how to think about integrity. So the first 2 are sort of locational. One is the literal location. Is it in the place where it was when it was significant, or what its period of significance is in the US? What is its overall setting? Has that changed or been compromised over time? The middle 3 are also quantifiable. So you have design. What did it look like? What does it look like now? Materials. What were the original materials? Which are significant changes of materials? And then workmanship is looking at how the things are put together. So that the first 5 are sort of quantifiable. The last 2 are qualitative elements. So feeling and association. It's sort of, does it feel like a place in the past that you're thinking about? And also the association with does it give association to the context you're investigating? So you have this interplay, and I think this is really important too, between significance and integrity. Significance being the strong evidence-based case for significance and a particular level of significance under 1 or more assessment criteria, and that's genericized for everybody. That basically, when you're assessing significance, this is what you do anywhere in the world if you're working in cultural heritage. And then the degree of integrity is a well-reasoned assessment of the physical property using the 7 aspects of integrity in this case, to conclude that the overall level of integrity is sufficient to convey its significance and is appropriate to its level of significance. The lower down in significance in the United States, the less sort of adherence to these things and as they were originally you need to have. And also, for example, something that's being recognized for its significance to design would need a very high level of integrity to convey that design expertise, and might be different than an important event happening at a place where there's been changes to the place, but it still exists. And so its original state might be less important. Again, this isn't. This is the framework I'm familiar with. I actually do this without even thinking about these things, but it would be a similar type of thing done throughout the world, and including New Zealand. So can I go to the next? So that's sort of looking at how you conceptualize whether or not something retains integrity, and that's important to conservation plans because that's all about the level of integrity, and then of course rating the parts. Now I just want to talk about properties and how this kind of plays into our properties planning. So we have conservation plans for most, if not all of our places, certainly in Central. Some of them are older than others. Some of them we're redoing right now. Some of them are in process. Some of them have been recently confirmed. But the conservation plan guides all of the maintenance we do at places. It's sort of like, is it the best thing for the place? Is it appropriate for the place? Is it necessary for maintaining the integrity of the place? So routine maintenance would be things that we budget into our properties projects. Just as a matter of fact, these are costs that remain roughly the same in any given year, except in inflationary periods, of course, where you have pest management, vegetation management, building warrant of fitness covering systems, certifications other than BWAFs, building washes, regular cleaning and rubbish management, ongoing minor repairs, all sorts of things, sort of nicks and scratches and broken bits. And security is a really important one. That's also part of routine maintenance, making sure it's safe and cared for. And then regular building checks by the owner and manager. So if you're not actually in the site every day or not using it, just making sure that you go by and sort of see. So this is all part of the routine maintenance. And again, these costs are built in every year, and they sort of vary only through periods of inflation. Could I have the next slide? So the other part of the conundrum is non-routine maintenance and works. So these are things that we do periodically. These aren't done annually. They aren't even done generationally in some cases. They might be one-off projects. They also might be projects that help you understand a place, not just caring for the place, but sort of why do we care about the place? So again, the conservation plan will more concretely guide these things, because a lot of these types of projects can dramatically change a place and change the conception of a place. Seismic strengthening would result in quite a bit of possible change to the actual structure and materials of a place. Roof replacement, which Angelica, I believe, will be talking about, can change the look of a place. If you don't have the materials right, or the color right, it may not be appropriate to the place. Building systems upgrades and replacement, heat, electric, fire suppression, security, and all of that. Major conservation works on such things as windows. We just got finished with a conservation assessment of 804 windows at all government buildings, which is no small feat, done by one of our casual employees. Including the full strip and repaint and timber repair for wood sheathing, which we just finished at Antrim, and structural work more generally. Drainage and landscaping. So if you do need some additional drainage, or you want to change the landscaping so that it's more appropriate, that would be a non-routine project. But it also includes disability accommodation and access, unexpected or emergency works. So they're non-routine in that they're unexpected. You haven't budgeted for them, but you hopefully have budgeted some money for those types of things. Signage and wayfinding would be falling into this. So how do we get visitors around our places safely and smartly? Interpretation programs. So this can be fixed interpretation through signage, as well as education and sort of tour interpretation. And then also things like interior decor refresh. It may seem superfluous or kind of fluffy, but you don't want to go into a historic place. You don't want to go into Antrim House and find holes in the carpet or wallpaper laying on the floor. So periodically, you do need to do a refresh of these things within reason. And then also not to forget that most heritage properties you're dealing with usually have some collections that vary from place to place and building to building. It could be art, it could be furniture, it could be any sorts of things. So collections care would factor into that. So you use conservation plans to help you plan this work in a way that's not detrimental to the integrity and the heritage values of the place. So now I'm going to move on to my colleagues. I think, Boris, you're next.
Wow, amazing timing, Jamie. Tēnā koutou, everyone. Thank you very much for passing on. It's not just me, it's also my colleague, Candida. Hi, Candida. I think, Candida, we agreed I'd do the introduction. So, kia ora, everybody. Tēnā koutou, ko Boris tōku ingoa. My name is Boris Bogdanovic. Ko kai whakahaere Ātiha. I am the Heritage Assets Manager at Pouhere Taonga, Heritage New Zealand. I manage 14 of our historic places in the northern region. Candida?
I am Candida. I'm working as a conservation advisor in the Auckland office with Boris. This was actually used to be Boris' old role, so I'm stepping on big shoes.
You're too kind. We're both architects by training, so we planned our presentation together. We've both previously either worked on or contributed, or in some cases written our own conservation plans. So thank you very much, Jamie, for the really good intro to some of the key concepts. Did you want to add anything, Candida?
No, if you just we just introduce the key points that we're going to touch, so that the transition will be smooth from yours to mine. Yeah, Boris will just introduce the Bible of conservation planning, the foundational document that taught all experts how to take care of producing that kind of documentation, and will tell us everything about it and give us some wonderful examples of some projects that he has been involved with during his career. And I will just briefly touch after that with some practical considerations about the key principles that from a practice experience, from our point of view, are important to be underlined when talking about conservation planning.
Cool. Thank you,
Boris,
Kia ora.
dive in.
Angelica, please, next slide. So as Candida has outlined, we've got 3 sections, and I'll be talking about giving an intro to conservation planning and giving a bit of background on my work here in New Zealand and overseas. Next slide, please, Angelica. So just a quick intro to this concept of conservation planning and management. Now, in New Zealand, in Aotearoa, we call them conservation plans. Previously working overseas, particularly in the UK where I was trained, we refer to them as conservation management plans. And I think that's a really, really important distinction, this idea that not only are we planning for the future, we are managing the day-to-day. And I think Jamie identified some of these key concepts as we conceive these documents. I was told that a conservation management plan or a conservation plan is only as good as how much it's used. And this is something that I abide by in my career, both in using them and writing them. So the sign of a good cons plan is a scruffy, peeling document that's always in hand, from the person who is doing maintenance all the way through those who are assessing the kind of work that needs to be done. And there in the upper corner is the man we have to thank for this Bible, as Candida's called it, Dr. James Semple Kerr himself, who's a bit of a hero of mine, and what a nice chap he looks indeed. He was an architectural historian and a heritage practitioner. He is from Australia, but we can't hold that against him. And he worked for the National Trust of Australia and prepared the notion of conservation planning as a response to the cases he was working in. I think it's also really important to realize that his PhD research, his beginnings of his career, were based on looking at historic prisons. And the reason I mentioned that is historic prisons, they're not much to look at. I mean, think about Mount Eden Prison here in Tamaki Makaurau. The importance and significance of that site is beneath its skin. And I think conservation planning is very much about that. And Jamie talked about that a little bit, allowing us a systematic process to understand the importance of a place or a site. The conservation plan is still really, really important. It's presently in its 7th edition. Australian ICOMOS, our partners across the sea, offer it free of charge online. I'm sure you've all looked at it. If not, please rush to it and read it as your bedtime reading. And I like this quote at the end I've included on this slide, which is, it's about managing change to a heritage item appropriately. And those key words, managing change, are also important, because conservation plans are not just about freezing something in a moment. They are about looking at how we can grow and develop and continue its function. Next slide, please, dear Angelica. So don't get scared, big slide here, but I thought what I'd talk very briefly in terms of the document and how we approach writing the document. Having written a few of these in my career, I can tell you they're pretty daunting the first time you do them, and as daunting to read and understand, but it's actually a very systematic process. So what I wanted to touch on is that key square in the middle of the slide pages. The first stage is about understanding the place, and that's about that tangible gathering of evidence, coordinating the information you find, and then assessing it and looking at that keyword significance, which you'll keep hear us mentioning a lot. The second stage is then the conservation policy and its implementation. So what that means is, once you've got your sense of what's special, what's important, what's significant, you need to decide based on its, as Jamie was mentioning, condition, location, etc., need. You need to decide on the conservation policies and implementation. Now, those are big words for what are the rules of play going forward? How do we make sure that the work that's happening to the building or the site or the place or the ruin, it makes sure that its significance is prioritized and correct uses are applied. I'll talk a little bit more about significance in the next slide, but significance itself has several layers. There are sites of exceptional significance, and there are some Australian examples there, like the Sydney Opera House, and those of, they say, D and little significance, sort of, you know, the veneer of a 70s cottage. Now, that doesn't mean it's any less important, but it means it's just less significant on that sliding scale. And in terms of significance, I include a statement of significance example there on the right. Again, Goulburn Jail in Australia, taken from Semple Kerr's example. And you can see some of the things that are considered in this site and why it was thought to be considerably significant, because, for example, the first bullet is the original radial plan. The second bullet is about the quality and inventiveness of masonry. So there are many considerations in how we consider what is significant on a site. Angelica, the next slide, please. This is an example of a conservation management plan I worked on myself here in actually in Tamaki Makaurau in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And it's interesting. It's something I did a couple of years ago that Candida is now reviewing as part of her work as a conservation advisor. My previous employer, my old boss, has submitted this conservation plan as part of the consideration of the works that he and his heritage firm are wanting to do to the building. So I thought it was an excellent and very pertinent example of how we approach this, but very briefly. So what you see in the upper left-hand corner on my screen is an aerial view of the Titirangi War Memorial Hall. Just your run-of-the-mill ordinary hall in which some of you may have seen a performance, done a gymnastics course, or just gone to a craft fair. But in the 70s, this was an example of cutting-edge, highly significant modern architecture that had a very deep and important cause. It was there to remember and memorialize the loss of life in the Second World War. And not only was the Titirangi War Memorial Hall important, the lower image beneath that aerial view says Titirangi's Landscape of Memory. Now, as part of our assessment, working at Burgess Street Architects and Knight Architects when I was there, was to look at the wider setting. And I think, again, Jamie touched on this. The wider setting is just as important to consider as the site or building itself. It's all about the place. And we talk a lot about this at Pouhere Taonga, where it's not just buildings, they're places that we're concerned with. So in the case of Titirangi War Memorial Hall, all around it were these references to the Second World War, to the First World War, to the Boer War, to New Zealand Aotearoa's participation in global conflicts. And we felt it was very important to set the building in that wider setting. Not to mention looking close at the building itself. And as you can see in the two images I've added there, the phasing plan, the heritage value plan, we literally looked bit by bit at the building's fabric and then determined what was original, what wasn't, what was significant, what wasn't, which then allowed us to make decisions about managing the building's future. Angelica, next slide, please. Jumping back into significance and policies. Now, again, this was mentioned in the previous talk. Significance is a very broad concept, and it's fed by many sub themes. And I've noticed this not just in Aotearoa, New Zealand, but very much across the world. Notions of history, notions of society, and I think particularly important in Aotearoa is mana whenua significance. It's something that, having returned to New Zealand, I've become very cognizant of, and it's something that at Pouhere Taonga, as a bicultural organization, we are prioritizing. But furthermore, we are also looking at the significance of architecture and aesthetics. So is it a representative example of a type or a design of style? We look at technological significance. Does a place demonstrate technical accomplishments? Is it unique in the materials or the way that it was built? And as I say, the final significance consideration is what we call cultural landscape significance. And that's, how does a site relate to its wider setting, and does that wider setting contribute to the meaning? So it's very much an iterative process, writing a conservation management plan or a conservation plan. You are constantly checking yourself both in the context of the history of a place, its present life and what it means to its community, to its users, and then also how do you massage all of that to make sure that the building continues or the site continues or the place continues to fulfill its function long into the future. And that's why the documents are so big and hence why they're so complex and hence why they can be very expensive. And that's one of the things that when we advise architects, or when I was a conservation advisor, we would advise architects to approach this very systematically and see them as an important pillar in their wider work of how they approach old sites. Next slide, please, Angelica. I wanted to give you just a few real world examples, and having talked a little bit about the work I was doing at the Titirangi War Memorial Hall, I thought I could tell you a bit about 3 projects I worked on overseas. As I say, I was internationally based until a couple of years ago, although I grew up and studied in New Zealand. I've been very lucky to work in Europe, the Middle East, and in Central Asia. So I'm giving the first two images are from a project I did in just south of London in Bromley, and this was a 13th century monastic building. The top image you can see there, it looks very medieval with a few additions. And when we came to the site, we thought, gosh, this is going to be the most important bit without a doubt, because to the back of the building, the lower image, what looks like a bunker or some kind of concrete prison, is actually an example of a fantastic modernist building designed by an eminent firm called Sealy and Paget in the 1920s. And what we realized was actually both were important. Age wasn't just a consideration, if that makes sense. It wasn't just the fact that there was this medieval monastic building. There was also this example of 20th century architecture. And that conservation plan was about balancing the priorities of both. The second image, the tall, skinny, Victorian-looking church with the funny, shiny tile box in front of it, that was St. Mary Magdalene's Church near Paddington Station, a building I had a long association with and grew to love very much. And the congregation was declining, and the Anglican Church decided to offer the gap between the church and the former church school to a social function. So there it was all about how do we make sure that the historic building doesn't get compromised by what's coming new. And that conservation plan very, very much focused on how you accommodate a new structure. So slightly different to the Priory, but very much in the same vein. And third, but certainly not least, the Treaty Court in Jordan. That was probably one of the most unusual projects I've ever worked on. That was an archaeological site where I was the project architect delivering some repair and conservation. And you can see that pile of stones sitting on top what looks like stepped terraces. Very quickly, those are Roman and Byzantine remains dating from the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th century of the Common Era. And because of Jordanian archaeological law, we were not allowed to remove them. We were not allowed to dispose of them, of course, and we were not allowed to take them off-site. So after some pretty heated negotiation, we came to a very happy conclusion where we agreed with the Ministry of Antiquities and Tourism to use those historic stones on the site as a retaining wall to protect the ruin. Now, that wouldn't happen in many, many other places, but we made sure that the stone was set in a lime mortar, so it was reversible, it could be removed. We documented the stones and their locations. It was a very tedious process, but that conservation plan and its policies meant that we could justify the work and protect the archaeological site long into the future. So there you are, 3 very different examples, 3 very different conservation plans, but all about trying to find the best solution for the site and manage its future. Thank you very much. I'll pass to you, Candida.
Thank you. So interesting, these projects, Boris. Thank you so much. And to the previous speakers, I just wanted to highlight some what we called practical considerations. And making a step back, why do we need this? Because as was highlighted from the previous presentations, these documents, conservation plans, are really essential from a professional perspective in delivering the best conservation outcome possible. But they're not always there. It's not always a conservation plan, and sometimes they're not up to date, because, as Boris said, this is a document that is lively, that needs to keep developing with the site. And so I, amongst these practical consideration, I wanted to focus on three categories: prioritizing, simplifying, and teamwork, or multidisciplinary collaboration. Prioritizing is a discourse that is very present into the policies, and we can consider a conservation plan a policy, a guideline itself. And so it's helpful that we do have at a national level a good set of policies and guidelines for not only the best practice conservation planning documentation, but also to understanding the heritage site that is the subject of the project. Understanding is then like is a keyword, as Boris underlined. The policies I'm talking about that can be used as a tool for guiding the production of these documents are the policy for government and management of cultural heritage places from the ministry. That is the most recent one. And of these, I wanted to highlight two key points, key items: the record and management of cultural heritage, and the understand the heritage places. This because recording and understanding, which are two aspects mutually beneficial in a conservation project, are clearly a priority within this process. And they link wonderfully with best practice. The best practice confectionery it is of these documents, which needs a list of items of recording, and recording becoming another keyword in this case. Can you please swap to the next slide, Angelica? So yeah, keep highlighting the policies that are present on in New Zealand and internationally. These words of recording, the priority of recording and communication becomes key. And this can be seen also internationally within the policies produced by UNESCO for what regards the management of World Heritage sites. The second practical consideration that I wanted to highlight is that of simplifying, and that also links with the concept of recording and communication, where like a good conservation plan for what is our practical experience is a document that can communicate in a very clear, visual, graphic way amongst all the actors that can participate in the process of conservation. Can you please change the slides, Angelica? It's probably gonna clarify what I'm saying. This is just a long list that I'm not gonna read through. But I know that this is gonna be kept as a resource, and I'm available for questions. afterwards. But this is a list of items of recording and communication of built heritage site in what's in best practice, and this is part of the Heritage New Zealand guidelines, investigation and recording of building and standing structures, which interestingly, it's part of the archaeological guidelines series, which is another demonstration that heritage expands within and beyond the borders of built heritage to the discipline of archaeology and to way beyond the cultural landscape and intangible dimensions. But for what concerns the built heritage realm, practical consideration is that a good recording, a good communication starts from a recording that follows some guidelines, and these are pretty much architectural best practice items that it would be very useful to implement in conservation management planning in this documentation and in all documents that want to present a heritage conservation project from what is our perspective. Next slide, please, Angelica. So this comes like my third practical consideration, which is teamwork, advocacy and education, which is something that as an organization we are involved in, and as participants in a group of experts and advocate for cultural heritage conservation. This is this that you see is just a visual representation of what we're trying to transmit in the context of academic education to the New Zealand students of cultural heritage conservation. And this is a good example of teamwork and cross-fertilization between different disciplines and between internationally rooted disciplines. The European background of traditional architectural conservation with the representation and recording that follows certain parameters that applied on a practical level becomes a day-to-day visual exercise that it's very helpful in terms of communication of what are the materials, the defects, the intervention due on that particular object, monument, or site. This is, of course, just to link to the previous presentation, happens when that process of understanding and assessing the value of the site has been completed, and we now want to communicate on the structure itself amongst all the players, understanding very clearly and quickly what are the works that need to be done in order to maintain that cultural heritage and to maintain that fabric. And it ties up to the discourse around priority, because these visual and graphic and a simple way of communicate, it helps with the planning part of this kind of documentation, when you can prioritize the operation that needs to be completed in the first in the closer future, and then the operation that needs to be planned for the future and in bigger cyclical terms, let's say. And next slide, please. And this is just to quickly show a series of snapshots of what a conservation and management and management plan produced on that scale of the UNESCO World Heritage could include and could look like, that clearly gives an idea of how the graphic, the schematics, and the clearest snappy communication can provide. And this is the planning for the Comune di Firenze World Heritage Center. But yeah, I tied it up with a quote from a policy that is actually from the New Zealand environment, to demonstrate that Aotearoa New Zealand and the international stage, for what concern conservation and management planning, are definitely in a ongoing exchange. Thank you. Hope that was helpful. I will pass to Angelica. I hope I didn't get too much time from your presentation.
All good, on time. Thank you so much, Candida.
Thank you.
Kia ora koutou, ngā mihi o te ahiai, ko Angelica Toko Ingoa, and I'm one of the policy advisors here at Heritage New Zealand Pouhere Taonga. One of the main components of my role involves managing conservation plans for some of our owned and operated properties. I'm based in Wellington as part of the national office, and we usually inhabit Antrim House on Bulcock Street as our headquarters. But in the last year, Antrim House has undergone through some non-routine maintenance, and it included seismic strengthening, some re-roofing and repainting. What used to be in shades of gray is now in shades of green. And we're extremely excited to move back in a few weeks, actually. Out of all the conservation plans that I've reviewed so far, ever since joining Pouhere Taonga, the Antrim House Conservation Plan is one of my favorites. Not only did it greatly aid us during the aforementioned non-routine maintenance, I consider it personally as the gold standard of what a conservation plan should be. And a copy of it should be available on our website if you would like to check it out. If we look at its contents, everything mentioned by my colleagues earlier in their presentation is included and listed. So the main chapters are an introduction, history, description, statements of significance, heritage values, influences on conservation policies, and finally, recommendations. From experience, one of the most important parts of a conservation plan is the heritage values chapter, specifically the heritage inventory. The heritage inventory itemizes all parts of the heritage place, from the ceiling finish down to its joineries. Not only does it list every nook and cranny, it assigned a heritage value in terms of degrees of significance. The core purpose of this inventory of space, elements, and fabric of the building is so that in case of future changes, whether this be repair, restoration, or adaptation to the fabric of the building, it can be planned and carried out in a way that has the least impact on its heritage values. Each element, space, item, or building fabric is assigned a heritage value to denote its relative importance to the building. And for the Antrim Conservation Plan, the author decided that a total of 4 degrees of significance is appropriate. So just very quickly, how it was ranked. So if a part of the building is given the heritage value of 1, it means that it is of exceptional heritage. It is generally assigned to a piece of the heritage fabric that is original or early modified, and it represents the Hannes family's time spent on Antrim House. And if it received a rating of heritage value 2, it is of moderate heritage significance. It is generally assigned to non-original fabric that is nevertheless appropriate to the building and contributes strongly to its heritage significance. So for example, on the screen, we're looking at bedroom 7, which has the heritage value of 2. And heritage value 3 the elevation, space, or fabric is of some heritage significance, it is generally assigned to non-original fabric that makes a positive contribution to the heritage significance. And last and, well, least, nil heritage value, it means that the element, space, or item of the building or fabric has little or no heritage significance. So for example, in bedroom 7, we could see that the floor, for example, is of modern carpet and underlay. So that gets a heritage value of nil. And in some cases, there's a repair material of a later date incorporated in the element or space. Unless such repairs have been extensive or badly executed, they are judged to have little or no negative impact on heritage values of the element. So for me, the inventory identifies the heritage significance and relative importance of each part of the building. And it also identifies the acceptable extent of intervention and change for each base and elevation that is consistent with maintaining and enhancing the building heritage values. At 297 pages, the Antrim House Conservation Plan is short and sweet in comparison to our other conservation plans, but it hits all of the marks of what should be included in a conservation plan. So like I mentioned earlier, I consider this as the gold standard, and yeah, it's available on our website if you guys want to have a look at it. And now over to Dean.
Oh, kia ora tātou. Thank you, Angelica, and everyone who's contributed. Sorry, that segue was nothing flash, but merely changing seats. So now we've got questions, time for partai, but just before that, I'd like to just briefly recap on what we've heard this afternoon, because I think it's really important. I might sort of give you time to think about a question to ask our panelists. So Jamie looked at the hierarchy of care. So in relation to the policy, this is around policy 1 and 9, I think. So looking at the understanding condition versus integrity, and I thought that was really interesting, seeing the differences in that and what integrity is, the intactness of place, and really how it carries value forward. And then looking at the routine and non-routine maintenance and what the differences of those are. Then, of course, Boris and Candida looking at prioritising policies and guidelines, but really that whole overview of what conservation plans do or conservation planning can do. Giving some of those concepts that are within there, and I really like also to look back on Dr. Kerr and that whole sort of the original ideas of the conservation plan, which has become an enduring tool in cultural heritage management today. So great to have that sort of that background to that. And then, of course, great to see some of those international examples, which we both are influenced by, and we influence ourselves, and particularly when we think about how we work in terms of our treaty relationship space is often looked at as leading in that area around the world. And great to have the example of our own Antrim House here at Heritage New Zealand Pouhere Taonga, which we're going back to in a couple of weeks, because it's been through a process of conserving, I guess it's non-routine in the sense that a lot of work was done in re-strengthening, re-roofing, also a beautiful new paint job, which requires that investigation and that understanding of past, that documentary investigation. So we will benefit from the conservation plan that Angelica was able to show us, which of course has been enduring, and it's still guiding what we do as an organisation. So it's really just putting that idea about this planning becomes an enduring thing through time. So with that, you've had plenty of time to think about some questions. I believe you fire those questions in the chat bit, and Angelica will let us know. Is there any there yet?
None yet.
None yet. Oh, there will be. I think it'd be really good. I'm sure some of you out there have examples of work you've done with the conservation plan, an experience of that on conservation planning, or maybe some thoughts about where you might start. I mean, how do you start this sort of process when you're thinking about a heritage building in your portfolio? So have we got any takers on that? I know it's Friday, but it'd be great to get a couple of questions going because our panelists are here to answer them.
Got one.
There we go, we got one. So we have a question. Kia ora. These plans are great for documenting the building and their significance. How do you suggest we capture the practical maintenance requirements and how these are managed considerately? So that's a question, it could be for any of our panelists, but anyone's got some ideas on, I guess, maintenance side of things. Yeah, kia ora, Jane.
So, I mean, maintenance is a really important thing to think about because poor maintenance over time can result in a lesser condition, which then can ultimately impact on the integrity of the place. So, I mean, the conservation plan can definitely help guide what types of maintenance are most necessary, what types of maintenance will protect the most important places, will allow you to prioritize what maintenance should be occurring, when it should be occurring. But on the whole, you need to sort of create a matrix of what do you need to do to care for the building appropriately, whether it's paint for weather tightness and roofing or the sort of smaller stuff, just sort of, I mean, we have maintenance plans that like I said, are kind of unchanging from year to year because those are the things that have to be done every year. So I think working out first what you need to do annually or regularly and sort of focusing on that stuff, because that's the kind of bedrock of good care and stewardship of a building, and then thinking about well, the condition of the building and what sort of non-routine maintenance would be best to be done first, or maybe if it's a large project, you have to think about phasing it and funding and that sort of thing. So you want to do the stuff you have to do every year first, and then you can sort of work out from there.
Set some priorities from that. Yeah. Right. Any other questions here? Yep.
Hold on a second. Kia ora. We've got a direct message from Boris, and Boris would like to know, I would love to hear a bit more from Angelica. What makes the Antrim House Conservation Plan the quote-unquote gold standard? Is it because of its simplicity, its clarity, its usefulness? You must see a lot of conservation plans. What makes this one stand out in a few points? Yes, you're quite right. It's one of the gold standards because it's simple. It captures everything well, and it's not too long because from what I've noticed, a lot of other conservation plans dwell heavily on the history section. Like it's a bit too lengthy to a point that it's no longer useful for a conservation plan. So that's one thing that I really love about it. And it's very concise, as I said, in comparison to all others. And what I love about it is it fully analyzed and synthesized all of the findings into a tidy chapter at the end with recommendations. So yeah, that is my answer. And I believe we have another question. Follow up, thinking about guidance for materials, etc., for contractors that are sympathetic to the building.
Anyone like to answer that one? So thinking about guidance for materials for contractors that are sympathetic to the building. So
I can say a little bit about that, Dean. I think it's kia ora. It's a very important question, and one that we get a lot, particularly in the wider context of insurance and replacement and like-for-like repair, all these big scary words. And then you think about things like often a historic building may be made of materials that are no longer available or are unsustainable or even harmful in some cases. So it's basically how long is a piece of string, and what are the uses that are needed, and what are we planning with this building? I think is and the key point there, I think, is finding a sympathetic contractor, which can seem quite daunting in Aotearoa, but there are experts around, and we're here to help, right? We're a free hotline. I used to say, sorry, Candida, people can call us up and say, call Candida and say, what are your thoughts on the situation? Jamie, you've got your hand up. Did you want to add something?
Yeah, if I can just use the Antrim House as an example, for larger projects, you can often have a conservation architect. We use the person who wrote that conservation plan. to provide a scope for the project. So I mean, his scope included, because wasn't just painting the most recent part, but also included timber repair of some really fine original timbers, mainly totara, but not exclusively. So he was able to identify what kind of materials might be available now to replace original material, and also we could make decisions about perhaps there were earlier replacements with, for example, in pine that had it degraded. We could make decisions about it perhaps in a lesser material because the original was missing. He also, I mean, he stipulated coatings, he stipulated paint types. I mean, there was a whole range of things. So basically getting a scope for the project that kind of, it's an extension really of the conservation plan, certainly not as long as the conservation plan, but they're fairly lengthy. So there is expertise out there to help you shape the sort of details of the project and the materials.
Oh, another one.
Oh, another one. These plans are commissioned by owners or organizations, and they invested a lot of time and money in creating them. Are they available for public viewing, or do we have to ask for permission? Now, I'll throw that out to our panelists.
I go ahead, Jamie.
No, I mean, we have at the Central Region, we have a library of all of the conservation plans we've reviewed over time. I mean, conservation plans that are commissioned by individual owners would be held by them. I guess we don't have real knowledge of all of them that exist. We certainly put them on file, whether or not, I mean, you could come in and look at them, for example, but you would need typically to talk to an owner, really, or a project manager if it was for a place that we haven't been involved with.
I think all I can add to that is I think it depends on the kind of building. I can tell you that I teach sometimes, and one of my students wanted to look at Mount Eden Prison. Now that there are some security implications there, even though the old Mount Eden Prison is closed, there needed checks and requirements. And I would agree with Jamie, if it's a privately commissioned report, copyrights may be held by the person who paid the money for the project. If you came to me at the Tamaki Makaurau office and said, I'd love to see this document, we'd make a time for you to come in and read it. And if you wanted special copies, well, a page or two, fair enough. But if you want the full document, if it's ours, we can make a decision about sharing it. Or if it's private, we can help facilitate that connection, and then we'd ask the owner. But they are remarkable resources. It's a shame they're not more available publicly.
Last two questions. Oh, yeah.
Oh, okay. So I've just got a comment here from, that's our Nick, isn't it?
Yeah.
From Heritage New Zealand. Just a comment really to reinforce that Heritage New Zealand lists Rārangi Kōrero has information supporting listings. This will include significance. Some earlier listings had less information, but the more recent listings are more fulsome. But not all is on list online, so you might need to request a copy of that from one of the officers. So, but these all contribute to conservation plans, and I think that what Nick is saying there. Yeah. Another question: most heritage places have been altered over time, and some alterations have significance in their own right. Does a conservation plan place any distinction on what time frame is the most significant? I would say that depends, and I might answer that myself, given the time we have left in this webinar. That would depend on the place and what those changes are. We did have an example for Boris. He showed us some change at the back of their building that had its own significance in its own right. So time is not always necessarily a marker of importance. Yeah. So now we better wrap it up, actually. See, all the questions came flooding in at the end, and thank you very much for that. It's really appreciated. Thank you to all of our panelists today. We'd also like to thank the Ministry for Culture and Heritage for supporting these webinars, but also holding the policy for government management of cultural heritage places. It's an important document that's really driving a lot of really positive activity within the public sector. So, just a total good at that. for the ministry. And just a special thank you to our policy team within Pouhere Taonga as well, who organise these webinars, in particular Angelica, not only organising but also presenting today. But thank you to all for participating. It must be time to go home. It's 5 o'clock on a Friday, so travel well home, and we'll finish off with the karakia. Unuhia, unuhia. Unuhia ki te uru tapanui. Kia wātia, kia mama, te nākau, te tinana, te wairua i te arataka tū. Ko ia rā e rongo, whakairia ake ki runga kia tina. Ina. Haumi e, hui e, tae ki e, kia ora. Listen out for the next webinar on your channels. Kia ora tātou.